traveler of time, to tonight's gentle descent into the quiet corners of history. Whether you're resting after a long day or simply seeking a moment of calm, I'm grateful to have you here. Do let me know where you're listening from and what hour it is for you. I imagine us as glowing dots on a spinning globe, connected by curiosity and the hush of night. And if this peaceful storytelling brings a little stillness to your day, feel free to subscribe. We'll have many more historical tales to share. Our story begins not with the crash of waves or the cry of gulls, but with the gentle tick of a pocket watch in the hands of a man who has not slept in 3 days. The year is 1900, and we find ourselves on a small boat cutting through the gray waters of the North Atlantic, 20 miles west of the Scottish mainland. The boat carries supplies mail, and one very worried harbormaster named Joseph Moore, whose weathered face reflects a concern that has been growing in his chest like a cold stone for the past 2 weeks. The destination of this small vessel is Eilean Mor, the largest of the Flannan Isles, a cluster of rocky outcrops that rise from the Atlantic like the knuckles of some ancient, sleeping giant. On the highest point of Eilean Mor stands a lighthouse, 75 feet of white-painted stone and iron, that has guided ships safely through these treacherous waters since it was first lit just over a year ago. It is a marvel of modern engineering, equipped with the finest optical equipment that Scottish craftsmanship can provide, and tended by 3 of the most experienced lighthouse keepers in the service. But for 2 weeks now, that light has been dark. The lighthouse was the pride of the Northern Lighthouse Board, a beacon that marked the successful completion of one of the most challenging construction projects ever attempted in Scottish waters. The Flannan Isles are among the most remote and inhospitable places in the British Isles, battered by Atlantic storms and surrounded by waters that have claimed countless vessels over the centuries. The decision to build a lighthouse there had been controversial. Some said it was too dangerous, too expensive, too ambitious for its own good. But the board had persevered, driven by the knowledge that every winter brought new disasters to ships attempting to navigate the treacherous waters around the outer Hebrides. The lighthouse would save lives, they argued, and no expense should be spared in the service of that noble goal. They had hired the finest engineers, the most skilled craftsmen, and when it came time to staff the new station, they had selected 3 men whose experience and reliability were beyond question. Thomas Marshall was the principal keeper, a man of 58 who had spent 34 years tending lighthouses along the Scottish coast. He was known throughout the service for his meticulous attention to detail, his unflappable demeanor in the face of the worst storms, and his ability to maintain equipment that lesser men might have given up for lost. Thomas had volunteered for the Flannan Isles posting, despite its isolation and harsh conditions, because he believed in the mission of the lighthouse service and took pride in accepting the most challenging assignments. James Ducat was the first assistant, 43 years old and almost as experienced as Thomas himself. James had started his career as a fisherman before joining the lighthouse service, and his intimate knowledge of Scottish waters made him invaluable in a posting like Eilean Mor. He was married with 4 children, and his wife Mary often said that he loved the sea more than he loved dry land. The isolation of the Flannan Isles didn't bother James. If anything, he seemed to find peace in the rhythm of lighthouse life, the routine of maintenance and vigilance that marked the passage of days and seasons. Donald MacArthur was the second assistant, the youngest of the 3 at 28, but already showing the steady character that would make him a principal keeper someday. Donald came from a family of lighthouse keepers. His father had tended the light at Skye, his grandfather at Arran, and he had grown up understanding that lighthouse work was more than a job. It was a calling. He was unmarried, soft-spoken, and possessed of the kind of quiet competence that made him the perfect choice for a remote posting where the 3 keepers would depend entirely on each other for both professional success and personal companionship. The 3 men had worked together before, most recently at the Lighthouse on Plata Island, where they had developed the easy camaraderie that comes from shared hardship and mutual respect. When the board offered them the posting at Eilean Mor, they had accepted as a team, understanding that the isolation and danger of the assignment would require the kind of trust that only comes from proven experience. The lighthouse itself was a testament to human ingenuity and determination, built from blocks of granite quarried on the mainland and transported to the island piece by piece. It stood as solid as the cliffs on which it rested. The optic assembly at its peak was a masterwork of precision engineering, a system of lenses and mirrors that could throw a beam of light 25 miles out to sea. The keeper's quarters were built into the base of the tower, with comfortable living spaces, a well-equipped kitchen, and storage areas for the supplies that would sustain the men through the long months between relief visits. The station was designed to be completely self-sufficient. Solar observations and careful record-keeping would tell the keepers when to expect storms. Rain collection systems and a carefully managed store of provisions would sustain them through the worst weather. The lighthouse beam was powered by a oil-burning system that was both reliable and efficient, and the keepers maintained multiple backup systems to ensure that the light would never fail when ships needed it most. Joseph Moore, the harbormaster, who now rode through the gray December morning toward Eilean Mor, knew all of this. He had helped plan the supply schedule for the lighthouse, had personally inspected the provisions and equipment that were sent to the station. He trusted Thomas Marshall and his crew implicitly. They were among the best men in the service, experienced professionals who understood their responsibilities and took them seriously, which was why the darkness of the Flannan light filled him with such unease. The light had last been seen on December 15th, exactly 2 weeks ago. The captain of a passing steamship had noted its presence in his log, commenting on the steadiness and brightness of the beam. But since then, despite clear weather and good visibility, no one had reported seeing the light. Ships passing through the area had sent messages asking about the status of the lighthouse. The Northern Lighthouse Board had received increasingly worried inquiries from captains who depended on the Flannan Light to navigate safely through the treacherous waters around the Outer Hebrides. At first, Mor had assumed some mechanical problem with the lighting apparatus. Such things happened, even at the best maintained stations. Perhaps a gear had broken, or the oil supply had been interrupted, or one of the mirrors had cracked. The keepers would have been working to repair whatever had failed, and the light would return once they had solved the problem. But days had passed, and still the light remained dark. Joseph Mor knew that Thomas Marshall would never allow a mechanical problem to go unrepaired for so long. If the primary lighting system had failed, the keepers would have rigged some kind of backup, even if it meant burning signal flares or oil lamps to warn passing ships of their presence. The complete absence of any light from Eilean Mor suggested something more serious than equipment failure. The weather had been another source of concern. December in the North Atlantic is notorious for its storms, and the waters around the Flannan Isles are among the most dangerous in the world. Mor had watched the barometric pressure and studied the weather reports from other stations along the coast. There had been several severe storms in the area over the past 2 weeks, with winds that could reach hurricane force and waves that could wash completely over the lower parts of small islands. Perhaps the keepers had been forced to take shelter in the lighthouse during a particularly severe storm, and something had happened. A structural failure, a fire, an injury that had left them unable to maintain the light. Mor's imagination had conjured dozens of possible scenarios, each more worrying than the last. The worst possibility, the one that Joseph Mor tried not to think about, but could not entirely dismiss, was that something had happened to the keepers themselves. Lighthouse work, despite all precautions, was inherently dangerous. Men could slip on wet rocks, could be swept away by unexpected waves, could suffer accidents with the heavy machinery that powered the light. If one of the keepers had been injured, the others might have been so occupied with caring for him that they had been unable to maintain the lighthouse routine, or perhaps, and this was the thought that kept Mor awake at night, something had happened to all three of them. A gas leak, perhaps, or carbon monoxide poisoning from the old burning equipment. Food poisoning from contaminated supplies. An accident that had somehow claimed all three lives at once. Joseph Mor had been in the lighthouse service for 25 years, and he had seen enough accidents and tragedies to know that the sea was an unforgiving environment that could turn deadly without warning. The Flannan Isles were particularly dangerous, remote, surrounded by treacherous waters, subject to weather that could change from calm to life-threatening in a matter of minutes. But he also knew Thomas Marshall, James Ducat, and Donald MacArthur. They were careful men, experienced professionals who understood the risks of their work and took every possible precaution. They were not the kind of men who would take unnecessary chances or ignore safety procedures. If something had happened to them, it would have been despite their best efforts, not because of carelessness or poor judgment. The boat carrying Joseph Mor to Eilean Mor was the SS Hesperus, a sturdy vessel that regularly serviced the lighthouses along the Scottish coast. Captain Harvey, who commanded the ship, was as experienced as any man in navigating the difficult waters around the Outer Hebrides. He had made the run to Eilean Mor many times since the lighthouse had become operational, and he knew the treacherous currents and hidden rocks that made the approach to the island so dangerous. But even Captain Harvey seemed unusually quiet as they approached the Flannan Isles on this gray December morning. The weather was reasonably good, overcast, but calm, with moderate winds and swells that, while substantial, were well within the capabilities of the Hesperus. Visibility was adequate, and they could see the lighthouse clearly as they drew near to the island. What they could not see was any sign of life. Normally, when the supply ship approached Eilean Mor, at least one of the keepers would appear on the landing platform to help with the unloading of supplies. The keepers maintained a strict schedule of watches, and there was always someone awake and alert during daylight hours. They would signal the approaching ship, help guide it safely to the landing area, and be ready to catch the lines that would secure it to the small dock that had been built for this purpose. But today, there was no one waiting on the landing platform. No signal from the lighthouse, no sign of movement around the station buildings. The white tower stood silent and still against the gray sky, as lifeless as the rocky cliffs that surrounded it. Joseph Mor felt the cold stone in his chest grow heavier. As the senior lighthouse official aboard the Hesperus, it was his responsibility to investigate whatever had happened on Eilean Mor. He checked his equipment one more time: a heavy oilskin coat to protect against the spray, a battery-powered electric torch, a first aid kit, a signaling pistol that could summon help if necessary. He also carried a detailed checklist of everything that should be inspected during a routine visit to the lighthouse, though he suspected that this visit would be anything but routine. Captain Harvey brought the Hesperus as close to the island as he dared, maneuvering carefully around the submerged rocks that made the approach so treacherous. The ship's crew prepared the small boat that would carry Mor to the landing platform, a journey that, under the best of circumstances, required skill and careful timing to navigate safely. As they prepared to launch the small boat, Mor took one last look at the lighthouse through his binoculars. The building appeared to be structurally sound. No obvious damage to the tower. No signs of fire or collapse. The weather monitoring equipment on the lighthouse roof seemed to be intact, and the glass panels of the light chamber appeared unbroken. Whatever had happened to the keepers, it had not been caused by structural damage to the lighthouse itself. The journey from the Hesperus to the landing platform took only a few minutes, but it felt much longer to Joseph Mor. The small boat rose and fell with the swells, and spray from the waves soaked through his oilskins, despite the crew's skill in handling the vessel. The landing platform, when they reached it, was slippery with spray and seaweed, and Mor had to be careful to maintain his footing as he climbed from the boat to the dock. The first thing he noticed was the silence. Lighthouses, even when functioning normally, are not quiet places. The mechanism that rotates the light creates a constant, rhythmic sound. The oil burners hiss and flicker. The wind whistles through the rigging and around the tower. But Eilean Mor was silent, except for the sound of waves against the rocks and the cry of gulls overhead. Mor made his way carefully up the path from the landing platform to the lighthouse buildings. The path was well maintained, with no obvious obstacles or damage. The supply shed near the dock appeared to be secure, with no signs of forced entry or damage from storms. Everything looked normal, except for the complete absence of human presence. The lighthouse keeper's quarters were built into the base of the main tower, with a heavy wooden door that was normally kept unlocked during the day. Mor approached the door and knocked loudly, calling out the names of the 3 keepers. There was no response. He tried the handle and found that the door was indeed unlocked. Taking a deep breath, he pushed it open and stepped inside. The interior of the lighthouse keeper's quarters was neat, clean, and completely empty of people. Mor's electric torch beam swept across the main living area, revealing furniture in its proper place, oil lamps ready for lighting, everything arranged exactly as it should be for men who maintained careful routines and took pride in the order of their domestic space. But there were signs that something was not quite right. The oil lamps had not been lit, despite the gray weather that would normally have required additional illumination. The fireplace was cold, with no recent ashes to suggest that it had been used in days. Most tellingly, there were dirty dishes on the kitchen table, plates and cups that suggested a meal had been interrupted or abandoned. Mor examined the dishes more closely. 2 of the 3 place settings showed signs of use: bread crumbs, traces of tea, a fork that had been used to eat what looked like the remains of a simple meal. The 3rd place setting was unused, the plate clean, the cup empty. It appeared that 2 of the keepers had been eating when something had caused them to leave the table, while the 3rd had not yet joined them for the meal. The sleeping quarters were equally puzzling. 2 of the 3 beds showed signs of recent use, with rumpled bedding and personal items nearby. The 3rd bed was made up neatly, as if it had not been slept in recently, or as if whoever had slept in it had made it up carefully before leaving. Mor began to develop a theory about what might have happened. Perhaps one of the keepers had been on duty in the lighthouse when something occurred. An accident, an emergency, a mechanical problem that required immediate attention. The other 2 keepers might have left their meal to help with whatever was happening, intending to return shortly. But something had prevented them from coming back. He climbed the spiral staircase that led to the lamp room at the top of the lighthouse, his electric torch beam dancing ahead of him in the enclosed space. The stairs were solid and well maintained, with no signs of damage or obstruction. The mechanism that rotated the light apparatus was silent, its gears and clockwork stopped in mid-rotation. The lamp room itself was a marvel of precision engineering, with the great lens assembly gleaming in the beam of Mor's torch. But the oil reservoirs that fed the light were nearly empty, and the wicks had burned down to nothing. It appeared that the light had simply run out of fuel, rather than being deliberately extinguished. This suggested that whatever had happened to the keepers had occurred gradually, rather than suddenly. The light had continued to burn until its fuel was exhausted, then had simply gone out. Mor checked the maintenance logs that the keepers were required to keep. The entries were written in Thomas Marshall's careful handwriting, documenting routine maintenance, weather observations, and the daily rotation of duties among the 3 men. The last entry was dated December 15th, the same day that the light had last been observed from passing ships. The entry for December 15th was brief and routine. Storm passing to south. Wind NW by WC lapping over East Landing. James on watch. Thomas and Donald maintaining equipment. Nothing in the log suggested any unusual problems or concerns, but there were no entries for December 16th or any subsequent dates. Whatever had happened to the keepers had occurred sometime after Thomas Marshall made his final log entry on the evening of December 15th. Joseph Mor spent the rest of the morning searching every part of the lighthouse station. He checked the equipment storage areas, the fuel storage facilities, the emergency supply caches. He examined the exterior of the building for signs of damage or forced entry. He searched the areas around the lighthouse for any trace of the 3 missing men. Everything was in perfect order, maintained with the precision and care that he would have expected from keepers of Thomas Marshall's caliber. The only things missing were the keepers themselves, and any clue about what had happened to them. By afternoon, Mor had to face the inescapable conclusion. Thomas Marshall, James Ducat, and Donald MacArthur had vanished without a trace. They had left no note, no message, no indication of their intentions. They had simply disappeared, leaving behind a lighthouse that was fully functional, except for the absence of the men who were supposed to tend it. Mor signaled to the Hesperus, and Captain Harvey sent the small boat to retrieve him. As they sailed back toward the mainland, Mor tried to make sense of what he had seen. The evidence suggested that the keepers had been going about their normal routines when something had caused all 3 of them to leave the lighthouse at the same time. But what could have been important enough to draw all 3 men away from their posts simultaneously? Lighthouse protocol required that at least 1 keeper remain at the station at all times. The only circumstances that would justify all 3 men leaving together would be a genuine emergency. A shipwreck that required rescue efforts, perhaps, or some kind of accident that demanded immediate attention. But Mor had found no evidence of any such emergency. The weather records from other stations along the coast confirmed that there had been several severe storms in the area during the past 2 weeks. Perhaps the keepers had been forced to abandon the lighthouse during one of these storms, seeking shelter in some location that had ultimately proven inadequate to protect them. But the lighthouse itself showed no signs of storm damage, and the keepers' quarters had clearly been occupied after the worst of the weather had passed. Could the men have tried to leave the island for some reason? Perhaps attempting to reach the mainland in an emergency, but there was no boat at the lighthouse station. Supplies and personnel were transported to and from Eilean Mor by scheduled visits from ships like the Hesperus. The keepers would have had no way to leave the island on their own, even if they had wanted to. Joseph Moore filed his report with the Northern Lighthouse Board within hours of his return to the mainland. The report was factual, detailed, and deeply troubling. 3 experienced lighthouse keepers had vanished without a trace from what should have been a completely secure location. There was no evidence of foul play, no sign of accident or mechanical failure, no indication that the men had left the island voluntarily. The news of the disappearance spread quickly through the close-knit community of Scottish lighthouse keepers. These men knew each other, had worked together, had shared the unique challenges and rewards of their profession. The loss of Thomas, James, and Donald was felt personally by every keeper from the Shetlands to the Solway Firth. Among those most affected was William Ross, who had worked with Thomas Marshall at 3 different lighthouse stations over the course of 15 years. Ross was a principal keeper himself now, stationed at the lighthouse on the Isle of May. And when he heard the news of the Flannan Isles disappearance, he felt as if he had lost members of his own family. Thomas was the finest lighthouse keeper I ever knew, Ross would later tell investigators. He was careful, methodical, never took unnecessary risks. If something happened to him and his crew, it wasn't because they made mistakes. Thomas didn't make mistakes. Ross had been among the keepers who had initially been considered for the Flannan Isles posting. The Northern Lighthouse Board had approached him about taking charge of the new station, recognizing his experience and reliability, but Ross had declined, citing his wife's poor health and his desire to remain closer to medical facilities on the mainland. Now, as he stood on his own lighthouse gallery, watching the December storms rage across the North Sea, Ross found himself wondering whether he might have made a different choice if he had known what would happen to Thomas and his crew. Could his presence have made a difference? Could his experience have helped prevent whatever tragedy had befallen the 3 men? The board immediately launched a full investigation, appointing a special commission that included some of the most experienced lighthouse engineers and maritime safety experts in Scotland. The commission was chaired by Sir Alexander Gibb, whose father had designed many of Scotland's most important lighthouses, and whose own expertise in marine engineering was recognized throughout the British Empire. Sir Alexander approached the investigation with the methodical precision that had made him one of the foremost engineers of his generation. He understood that the disappearance of the Flannan Isles keepers was not just a tragic mystery, but a potential threat to the safety of the entire lighthouse system. If experienced keepers could simply vanish from what should have been a secure location, then every lighthouse station in Scotland might be at risk. The first step was to conduct a more thorough search of Eilean Mor and the surrounding waters. Additional inspectors were sent to the island, equipped with the most advanced search equipment available. They examined every inch of the lighthouse buildings, looking for clues that Joseph Moore might have missed during his initial inspection. The search team was led by Robert Muirhead, a lighthouse engineer who had supervised the construction of the Flannan Isles station and knew every detail of its design and construction. Muirhead had worked with all three of the missing keepers during the installation and commissioning of the lighthouse equipment, and he had personally trained them in the operation and maintenance of the complex optical and mechanical systems. I knew these men, Muirhead explained to the commission. I had complete confidence in their abilities. Thomas Marshall, in particular, was one of the most conscientious keepers I had ever encountered. He insisted on understanding every aspect of the lighthouse operation, down to the smallest mechanical detail. Muirhead's team spent 3 days on Eilean Mor, examining everything from the foundation stones of the lighthouse to the weather monitoring equipment on its roof. They tested every piece of machinery, analyzed every component of the lighting system, and searched for any sign of mechanical failure that might have contributed to the keeper's disappearance. What they found was a lighthouse in perfect condition. Every system was functioning exactly as designed. The only problems they discovered were minor issues that had resulted from 2 weeks of unattended operation. Dust on some of the lenses, slight irregularities in the clockwork mechanism that rotated the light, small adjustments that would normally have been made as part of the keeper's daily maintenance routine. The search of the island itself was equally thorough and equally fruitless. The team examined every cliff face, every hidden cove, every possible location where bodies might have been washed ashore or trapped by falling rocks. They used boats to search the waters immediately around the island, dragging nets through areas where currents might have deposited anything that had fallen into the sea. They found nothing. No clothing, no personal effects, no human remains. It was as if Thomas Marshall, James Ducat, and Donald MacArthur had simply evaporated into the December air. The families of the missing keepers were interviewed extensively as investigators tried to determine whether any of the men had been experiencing personal problems that might have affected their judgment or their commitment to their duties. These interviews were conducted with great sensitivity, as the families were not only grieving the loss of their loved ones, but also struggling to understand how such experienced men could have simply disappeared. Mary Ducat, James's wife, was questioned at her home in Oban, where she lived with their 4 young children. Mary was a strong woman who had married a lighthouse keeper, knowing the risks and isolation that the profession entailed. But the disappearance of her husband had left her devastated and bewildered. James loved his work, she told the investigators. He used to say that lighthouse keeping was the most important job in the world because it was about saving lives. He was proud to be stationed at Flannan Isles, even though it meant being away from home for longer periods. He said the lighthouse there would save hundreds of lives over the years. Mary described her husband as a careful, thoughtful man who never took unnecessary risks and who always followed established procedures. He had written to her regularly from the lighthouse, and his letters had given no indication of any problems or concerns. His last letter, received just a week before his disappearance, had been cheerful and routine, discussing the weather, the condition of the equipment, and his anticipation of the Christmas relief rotation that would allow him to spend the holiday with his family. The families of Thomas Marshall and Donald MacArthur provided similar testimony. Both men had been experienced, dedicated keepers who took their responsibilities seriously. Neither had shown any signs of distress or unusual behavior before taking up their posts at Flannan Isles. Margaret MacArthur, Donald's mother, described her son as a young man who had been born to the lighthouse service. Donald could read weather signs like other people read books, she told the investigators. He understood the sea, respected it, but wasn't afraid of it. He knew how to be safe in dangerous conditions. Weather records were analyzed in extraordinary detail as investigators tried to determine whether atmospheric conditions might have played a role in whatever had happened to the keepers. The meteorological data came from multiple sources: other lighthouse stations, weather observation posts, ship's logs, and the automated recording equipment that had recently been installed at several locations along the Scottish coast. The analysis was conducted by Dr. James Butchin of the Edinburgh Meteorological Office, one of Scotland's leading experts in marine weather patterns. Dr. Butchin had spent 20 years studying the atmospheric conditions around the Scottish coast, and he understood better than anyone the violent storms that could develop in the North Atlantic with little warning. Weather during the period in question was severe, but not unprecedented. Dr. Butchin reported to the commission there were several significant storm systems that passed through the area between December 15th and December 29th, with winds reaching speeds of up to 70 miles per hour and waves of considerable height. But Dr. Butchin's analysis also revealed something puzzling. The most severe storm of the period had occurred on December 17th and 18th, 2 days after the keepers had last been seen. If the men had disappeared during this storm, they would have already been missing for 48 hours before the worst weather arrived. The storm of December 15th, which coincided with the last confirmed sighting of the lighthouse beam, had been significant but not exceptional. Winds had reached 45 miles per hour, strong enough to be dangerous, but well within the range of conditions that experienced lighthouse keepers would have been trained to handle. Keepers at Flannan Isles would have experienced much worse storms than this, Dr. Butchin explained. The lighthouse was designed to withstand winds of up to 100 miles per hour, and the keepers would have been trained in procedures for securing equipment and taking shelter during severe weather. As the investigation continued, Sir Alexander Gibb began to develop a theory about what might have happened to the missing men. The evidence suggested that some kind of emergency had occurred that required the immediate attention of all three keepers. This emergency must have been serious enough to justify violating the cardinal rule of lighthouse operation, that at least one keeper must remain at the station at all times. But what kind of emergency could have demanded such a response? Gibb considered several possibilities. Perhaps they had spotted a ship in distress and had attempted a rescue operation. Perhaps some critical piece of equipment had failed in a way that required all three men to work together to repair it. Perhaps they had discovered a fire or structural damage that posed an immediate threat to the lighthouse. Any of these scenarios could have led to a situation where all three keepers left the lighthouse simultaneously. But none of them explained why the men had never returned, or why no trace of them had ever been found. The commission also interviewed other lighthouse keepers who had worked with the missing men, hoping to gain insight into their personalities, their methods, and their likely responses to various emergency situations. These interviews painted a consistent picture of three highly competent professionals who understood their responsibilities and would never have abandoned their posts without compelling reason. Alexander Campbell, who had served as second assistant under Thomas Marshall at the Plata Island Lighthouse, described Thomas as a man who planned for every contingency. Thomas used to say that lighthouse keeping was 99% routine and 1% emergency, but that the 1% was what mattered most. Campbell told the investigators. He drilled us constantly on emergency procedures. He made sure we knew exactly what to do if equipment failed, if someone was injured, if severe weather threatened the station. Campbell's testimony reinforced the commission's belief that whatever had happened to the Flannan Isles keepers, it had been something truly extraordinary, an emergency so severe and so immediate that even Thomas Marshall's careful planning and extensive preparation had been inadequate to deal with it. The commission also examined the design and construction of the lighthouse itself, wondering whether some flaw in the building might have contributed to the tragedy. This examination was conducted by the same engineers who had supervised the original construction, and they brought to bear all the expertise that had made Scottish Lighthouse engineering the finest in the world. The Flannan Isles Lighthouse had been built to the highest standards, with features specifically designed to protect the keepers from the harsh conditions of their environment. The tower itself was constructed of granite blocks, fitted so precisely that no mortar was needed in many joints. The keepers' quarters were built into the base of the tower, protected by walls 3 feet thick and designed to withstand the most severe storms. The lighthouse incorporated the latest safety features, including multiple escape routes, emergency communication equipment, and backup systems for all critical functions. The design had been approved by the most experienced lighthouse engineers in the service, and similar structures had been operating safely at other locations for decades. There was nothing inherently dangerous about the lighthouse design, concluded James Walker, the engineer who had supervised its construction. The building was as safe as human engineering could make it. If something happened to the keepers, it was not because of any flaw in the structure or its equipment. As the investigation progressed, attention began to focus on the waters around Eilean Mor and the possibility that the keepers had somehow been swept into the sea. The commission commissioned a detailed study of the currents, tides, and wave patterns around the Flannan Isles, hoping to understand how bodies or debris might move if they entered the water near the lighthouse. This study was conducted by Professor David Robertson of the University of Glasgow, whose research on oceanographic conditions had made him one of the leading experts on Scottish coastal waters. Robertson spent several weeks analyzing tidal charts, current measurements, and historical data on how objects moved through the waters around the Outer Hebrides. Currents around the Flannan Isles are complex and unpredictable, Robertson reported. Objects entering the water there could be carried in any direction, depending on the specific conditions at the time. During winter storms, the water movement becomes even more chaotic, with powerful currents that could transport debris for hundreds of miles. Robertson's analysis suggested that if the keepers had somehow fallen or been swept into the sea, their bodies could have been carried far from the island before the search began. The complex current patterns around the Hebrides meant that remains might never be found, or might wash ashore on distant beaches months, or even years later. But this explanation, while scientifically plausible, still didn't answer the central question. What had caused all three experienced keepers to leave the safety of the lighthouse and venture into conditions dangerous enough to result in their deaths? The commission also considered the possibility of human agency, that someone had come to the island and harmed the keepers, or that the men had been taken away against their will. This theory was investigated thoroughly, despite the remote location of the lighthouse and the difficulty of reaching it without being detected. Detective Inspector Donald MacNab of the Scottish Police was assigned to investigate this possibility. MacNab was an experienced officer who had handled numerous missing persons cases, and he approached the Flannan Isles mystery with the same methodical approach he would have used for any criminal investigation. MacNab's investigation focused on determining whether anyone with hostile intentions could have reached Eilean Mor during the period when the keepers disappeared. He examined shipping records, interviewed the crews of vessels that had passed through the area, and checked for reports of suspicious activities along the Scottish coast. What he found was that reaching the Flannan Isles required considerable maritime skill and knowledge of local conditions. The island was surrounded by dangerous waters, with submerged rocks and unpredictable currents that made navigation treacherous, even for experienced sailors. landing on the island was possible only during relatively calm weather, and only at specific locations where small boats could safely approach the shore. It would have been extremely difficult for strangers to reach the island without the keepers being aware of their approach, McNabb reported. The lighthouse was positioned to provide excellent visibility in all directions, and the keepers maintained regular watches throughout the day and night. Any approaching vessel would have been spotted long before it reached the landing area. Moreover, McNabb found no evidence of any individuals or groups who might have had reason to harm the lighthouse keepers. The men had no known enemies, no involvement in disputes that might have motivated violence against them. They were respected members of their communities, known for their professionalism and dedication to their work. The criminal investigation ultimately concluded that foul play was highly unlikely. The isolation of the lighthouse, the difficulty of reaching it undetected, and the absence of any motive for harming the keepers all argued against the possibility that they had been victims of human violence. As winter gave way to spring, the Commission's investigation began to focus on the most likely scenario: that the three keepers had encountered some kind of natural emergency that had required all of them to leave the lighthouse, and that this emergency had ultimately resulted in their deaths. The Commission examined numerous precedents from other lighthouse stations, looking for cases where similar emergencies had occurred. They found several incidents where lighthouse keepers had been forced to leave their stations to deal with immediate threats. Equipment failures that posed fire hazards, structural damage from storms, rescue operations for ships in distress. In most of these cases, the keepers had been able to handle the emergency and return safely to their duties. But there were exceptions, cases where keepers had been injured or killed while dealing with emergencies, sometimes resulting in the temporary abandonment of lighthouse stations. The Commission's final report, published 6 months after the disappearance, concluded that Thomas Marshall, James Ducat, and Donald MacArthur had most likely encountered an emergency that required immediate action by all three keepers. The nature of this emergency could not be determined from the available evidence, but it had apparently been severe enough to justify the unprecedented step of leaving the lighthouse unattended. The report speculated that the keepers had been attempting to secure equipment or rescue supplies during the storm of December 15th, when they were swept into the sea by an unexpectedly large wave. Such waves, known as rogue waves or freak waves, could appear suddenly during storms, reaching heights far greater than the surrounding swells. It is the Commission's conclusion, Sir Alexander Gibb wrote, that the three keepers encountered conditions beyond their control, despite their considerable experience and careful adherence to established procedures. Their disappearance was a tragic accident, not the result of negligence or poor judgment on their part. Report praised the missing keepers for their dedication and professionalism, noting that the lighthouse had been maintained in perfect condition up until the time of their disappearance. It also recommended several changes to lighthouse procedures, including modifications to emergency protocols and improvements to communication systems that might prevent similar tragedies in the future. But for all its thoroughness and authority, the Commission's report could not answer the questions that continued to haunt everyone who had known the missing men. What exactly had happened on Eilean Mor during the night of December 15th, 1900? What emergency had been serious enough to draw 3 careful, experienced men away from the safety of their lighthouse? And why had no trace of them ever been found? The lighthouse on Eilean Mor was restaffed within a month of the publication of the Commission's report. The new keepers were carefully selected not only for their technical competence, but also for their psychological resilience. The Northern Lighthouse Board understood that serving at the Flannan Isles would require men who could cope with the knowledge of what had happened to their predecessors. The first replacement keeper was John Milne, a veteran of 23 years in the lighthouse service, who had specifically requested the Flannan Isles posting despite its ominous reputation. Milne was a practical man who approached the mystery of his predecessor's disappearance with the same methodical attention he brought to all aspects of his work. Whatever happened to Thomas, James, and Donald, it won't happen to us, Milne told his assistants when they took up their posts. We know something went wrong, which means we can be prepared for it. We'll follow procedures even more carefully than they did, and we'll make sure at least one of us stays at the lighthouse, no matter what emergency might arise. Milne and his crew served at the Flannan Isles for 3 years without incident, maintaining the light and proving that the lighthouse could be operated safely despite the tragedy that had occurred there. Their successful tenure helped restore confidence in the lighthouse service and demonstrated that the disappearance of the original keepers had been an exceptional event rather than evidence of some inherent danger in the posting. But the mystery of what had happened to Thomas Marshall, James Ducat, and Donald MacArthur continued to fascinate the public imagination. Newspapers and magazines published numerous articles speculating about the disappearance, and amateur investigators proposed dozens of theories to explain what had become known as the Flannan Isles mystery. Some of these theories were plausible, based on reasonable interpretations of the available evidence. Others were fanciful, invoking everything from sea monsters to supernatural forces to explain the inexplicable disappearance of 3 experienced men from what should have been a secure location. The mystery was further complicated by the discovery, several months after the disappearance, of a bottle containing what appeared to be a message from one of the missing keepers. The bottle was found on a beach on the island of Lewis, about 40 miles from Eilean Mor, and it contained a piece of paper with writing that some experts believed matched Donald MacArthur's handwriting. The message was brief and cryptic. Storm passing. All well, Donald. If authentic, it suggested that the keepers had survived the initial emergency that had caused them to leave the lighthouse. But the message raised as many questions as it answered. When had it been written? How had the bottle ended up in the sea? And if the keepers were all well, when the message was written, what had happened to them subsequently? Handwriting experts were divided on whether the message was authentic. Some concluded that it was indeed written by Donald MacArthur, while others argued that it was a hoax created by someone seeking attention or attempting to provide false hope to the families of the missing men. The controversy over the message was never resolved, and it became another element in the growing folklore surrounding the Flannan Isles mystery. The bottle and its contents were preserved by the Northern Lighthouse Board, but they provided no definitive answers about the fate of the missing keepers. As the years passed, the Flannan Isles Lighthouse continued to operate, guided by a succession of keepers who served with full knowledge of the mystery that surrounded their posting. Most served without incident, but the isolation and eerie atmosphere of the lighthouse seemed to affect everyone who worked there. Several keepers reported strange experiences, unexplained sounds, the sensation of being watched, equipment that seemed to operate on its own. While these reports were probably the result of imagination influenced by knowledge of the disappearance, they contributed to the lighthouse's reputation as a haunted place where the spirits of the missing keepers continued their eternal watch. William MacLeod, who served as principal keeper at Flannan Isles from 1905 to 1908, described his experience to a journalist years later. You couldn't help but think about Thomas, James, and Donald when you were alone on watch at night. Sometimes I would find myself listening for their footsteps on the stairs, or expecting to see them when I turned around. It wasn't frightening, exactly, but it was unsettling. Lighthouse was eventually automated in 1971, eliminating the need for keepers to live permanently on the island. The automation was part of a broader modernization of the Scottish lighthouse system, but it also marked the end of an era for Eilean Mor and the men who had served there. The last keepers to serve at the Flannan Isles were Robert Morrison and his assistant, David Fraser. Morrison had specifically requested the posting because he was fascinated by the history of the lighthouse and the mystery of the missing keepers. He spent his 3 years on the island researching the disappearance, examining every piece of evidence and every theory that had been proposed over the decades. I never found any new answers, Morrison later wrote. The mystery is as complete today as it was in 1900. 3 good men simply vanished, and despite all our investigations and theories, we still don't know why or how. The automated lighthouse continues to operate today, its beacons sweeping across the North Atlantic waters with the same reliability that Thomas Marshall and his colleagues would have demanded. The keepers' quarters stand empty now, preserved as a monument to all the men who served at this remote and challenging post. Visitors to the Flannan Isles can still see the lighthouse standing proud against the Atlantic sky. Its white tower, a testament to human determination to bring safety and order to one of the world's most dangerous maritime environments. The building shows no signs of the tragedy that occurred there more than a century ago. the mystery of the missing keepers continues to draw people who are fascinated by one of maritime history's most enduring puzzles. The memorial plaque installed by the Northern Lighthouse Board in 1950 bears a simple inscription: in memory of Thomas Marshall, James Ducat, and Donald MacArthur, who disappeared from this lighthouse on December 15, 1900, while faithfully performing their duties. Their dedication to the safety of mariners will never be forgotten. But perhaps the most fitting memorial to the missing keepers is the light itself, which continues to shine each night across the waters they once guarded. Every ship that passes safely through the treacherous waters around the Flannan Isles owes a debt to their sacrifice, whether that sacrifice was planned or simply the tragic result of circumstances beyond their control. The mystery of their disappearance may never be solved, but their legacy lives on in the principle they embodied, that some duties are so important that men will risk everything to fulfill them, even unto death. They joined the countless others who have given their lives to the sea, but they did so in service of a cause that was greater than themselves. The ancient and noble mission of guiding travelers safely home through the darkness. The story of the Flannan Isles keepers became woven into the broader tapestry of Scottish maritime folklore, joining the countless tales of ships lost in storms, of heroic rescues, and of the eternal struggle between human courage and the vast indifference of the sea. But unlike many maritime mysteries, which fade from memory as the years pass, the disappearance of Thomas Marshall, James Ducat, and Donald MacArthur seemed to capture something deeper in the public imagination. Perhaps it was the completeness of their vanishing, the way three experienced men had simply stepped out of the world without leaving so much as a footprint behind. Perhaps it was the dedication they had shown to their duties, maintaining their lighthouse in perfect condition, even as some unknown catastrophe approached. Or perhaps it was the reminder that even in an age of growing technological mastery, there remained mysteries that human reason could not penetrate, forces that could not be controlled or predicted. In the decades that followed, the Flannan Isles mystery inspired numerous works of literature, from scholarly investigations to romantic poems to sensational novels. Each generation seemed to find in the story a reflection of their own fears and fascinations, their own understanding of humanity's relationship with the natural world. One of the most thoughtful treatments of the mystery was written by Dr. Margaret Sinclair, a historian at the University of Edinburgh, who spent 5 years researching the disappearance for her doctoral dissertation. Dr. Sinclair approached the case not just as a historical puzzle to be solved, but as a window into the lives and working conditions of lighthouse keepers in the early 20th century. Flannan Isles mystery cannot be understood in isolation, Dr. Sinclair wrote in her 1955 study. It must be seen as part of the larger story of men who chose to dedicate their lives to one of the most dangerous and isolated professions in the world. These were not ordinary men doing ordinary work. They were specialists, almost priests of the sea, who had committed themselves to a calling that demanded everything they had to give. Dr. Sinclair's research took her to lighthouse stations throughout Scotland, where she interviewed dozens of retired keepers and their families. She documented the unique culture that had developed among lighthouse personnel, the unwritten codes of conduct and mutual support that bound together men who shared the risks and isolation of their profession. What emerged from her research was a portrait of a community that was both tightly knit and widely scattered, connected by shared experiences and common dangers rather than by geographic proximity. Lighthouse keepers formed lasting friendships with colleagues they might see only during brief relief rotations, maintained correspondences that spanned decades, and created informal networks of mutual support that extended to the families of their fellow keepers. When Thomas Marshall, James Ducat, and Donald MacArthur disappeared, Dr. Sinclair observed, the entire lighthouse community felt the loss personally. These men were not just statistics in some official report. They were friends, colleagues, mentors, and examples of what it meant to be a lighthouse keeper. This sense of personal loss was particularly acute for the keepers who had to take over the Flannan Isles station after the disappearance. They were not just replacing missing personnel. They were stepping into the roles of men who had vanished under mysterious circumstances, taking up duties that had somehow proved fatal to their predecessors. John Milne, the first replacement principal keeper, later described the psychological challenge of serving at Eilean Mor. Every day, you were reminded of what had happened to the men who had been there before you. You couldn't check the equipment without wondering what Thomas Marshall had been thinking when he made his last log entry. You couldn't stand watch at night without imagining James Ducat looking out at the same waters just before he disappeared. It required a special kind of mental discipline to focus on your duties and not let your imagination run away with you. But Milne and his successors also found strength in their knowledge of the missing keeper's dedication. We knew that Thomas, James, and Donald had died doing their duty, Milne explained. That knowledge didn't make their loss any less tragic, but it did give meaning to our own service. We were carrying on work that they had considered worth dying for. Psychological challenges of serving at the Flannan Isles were recognized by the Northern Lighthouse Board, which took special care in selecting replacement keepers for the station. Men chosen for Eilean Mor were typically experienced veterans who had demonstrated not only technical competence, but also emotional resilience and strong mental discipline. The board also implemented new procedures specifically designed to address the isolation and psychological pressures of the Flannan Isles posting. Relief rotations were shortened from the standard 6 months to 4 months, reducing the amount of timekeepers spent on the remote island. Additional communication equipment was installed, allowing more frequent contact with the mainland. Emergency protocols were revised to ensure that keepers would never again be placed in situations where all 3 men might have to leave the lighthouse simultaneously. Despite these precautions, Serving at the Flannan Isles remained one of the most challenging assignments in the Lighthouse service. The isolation was profound, the weather was harsh, and the knowledge of what had happened to the original keepers created a psychological burden that affected everyone who worked there. Alexander Ross, who served as second assistant at Flannan Isles from 1910 to 1912, described the experience in a letter to his wife. "The lighthouse runs perfectly, and we maintain it as carefully as Thomas Marshall ever did. But there are moments, usually late at night, when the wind is howling around the tower, when you can't help but wonder what those 3 men saw or heard on their last night. Were they afraid? Did they understand what was happening to them? Or did whatever took them come so quickly that they had no time to realize their danger?" These questions haunted many of the keepers who served at Eilean Mor over the decades. The completeness of the original keeper's disappearance, the absence of any bodies or physical evidence, created a void that the human imagination rushed to fill. In the absence of facts, speculation flourished, and the lighthouse became associated with increasingly elaborate theories about what might have happened. Some of these theories were based on legitimate scientific possibilities. Dr. Robert Morrison, a marine biologist at the University of St. Andrews, proposed in 1923 that the keepers might have encountered a marine avalanche, a sudden underwater landslide that could generate massive waves capable of reaching unprecedented heights. Such waves, Morrison argued, could have struck the island with no warning, sweeping away anyone who happened to be outside the lighthouse at the time. Morrison's theory was supported by geological evidence, showing that the sea floor around the Flannan Isles was composed of unstable sediments that could shift during storms or earthquakes. A submarine landslide could indeed generate waves of extraordinary size, and such waves would leave no lasting evidence of their passage once they had dissipated. But other scientists disputed Morrison's theory, pointing out that marine avalanches were extremely rare events that typically occurred in much deeper waters than those surrounding the Flannan Isles. Moreover, such an event would likely have affected other areas along the Scottish coast. Yet no unusual wave activity had been reported elsewhere during the period when the keepers disappeared. Dr. Emily Watson, a meteorologist at the Royal Observatory in Edinburgh, proposed an alternative explanation based on atmospheric phenomena. Watson had studied reports of earthquakes, sudden changes in atmospheric pressure that could generate powerful wind gusts or create localized weather disturbances of extraordinary violence. It is conceivable, Watson wrote in 1926, that the Flannan Isles were struck by an atmospheric disturbance of such violence that it literally lifted the 3 keepers from their feet and carried them out to sea. Such phenomena have been reported in other locations, though rarely with such devastating effect. Watson's theory was intriguing, but like Morrison's marine avalanche hypothesis, it lacked conclusive evidence. No other weather stations had recorded unusual atmospheric conditions during the relevant time period, and the lighthouse itself had shown no signs of damage from extreme winds. As scientific theories proliferated, so did more speculative explanations. Some writers suggested that the keepers had encountered a German submarine operating covertly in Scottish waters and had been killed to prevent them from reporting its presence. Others proposed that they had witnessed some kind of secret government experiment and had been eliminated to maintain security. These theories reflected the growing tensions of the early 20th century as European nations prepared for what would become the First World War. The idea that foreign agents might be operating in remote Scottish waters seemed plausible to many people, particularly those who were already suspicious of German intentions. But investigation by naval intelligence officers found no evidence to support theories of foreign involvement. German submarine activity in Scottish waters was carefully monitored by the Royal Navy, and there had been no reports of unauthorized vessels in the area around the Flannan Isles during December 1900. Perhaps the most persistent alternative theory was that the keepers had not died at all, but had somehow left the island voluntarily. Proponents of this theory argued that the men might have been recruited for some secret mission, or might have chosen to disappear for personal reasons that they could not reveal to their families or employers. This theory was investigated thoroughly by both the lighthouse authorities and the police, who examined the personal finances and backgrounds of all three keepers. What they found was evidence of men who were deeply committed to their families and their profession, with no apparent motive for voluntary disappearance. Thomas Marshall had been planning to retire within the next 5 years and had been saving money to buy a small cottage near Oban where he could spend his remaining years. James Ducat had 4 young children who depended on his income, and he had recently taken out additional life insurance to provide for them in case of his death. Donald MacArthur had been courting a young woman in his home village and had spoken to friends about his intention to propose marriage after completing his service at Flannan Isles. None of these circumstances suggested men who were planning to abandon their responsibilities and start new lives elsewhere. Moreover, the practical difficulties of leaving the island secretly would have been almost insurmountable. There were no regularly scheduled boats, no way to communicate with the mainland except through official lighthouse channels, and no obvious means of reaching safety without the assistance of the very authorities they would presumably have been trying to avoid. The investigation into the possibility of voluntary disappearance was finally closed in 1903 when Detective Inspector McNabb issued his final report concluding that there was no credible evidence to support such a theory. The 3 keepers had died, McNabb concluded, though the exact circumstances of their deaths might never be known. As the years passed and the mystery remained unsolved, the Flannan Isles Lighthouse began to acquire a reputation that extended far beyond the maritime community. The story was featured in newspapers and magazines throughout the British Empire, and it became a popular subject for travel writers and adventure novelists who were drawn to its combination of mystery and remote, dramatic setting. One of the most influential treatments of the mystery was a poem by Wilfred Wilson Gibson, published in 1912, which imagined the final hours of the three keepers as they faced some unnamed terror approaching their lighthouse. Gibson's poem, with its haunting refrain of 3 men alive on Flannan Isle, who thought on 3 men dead, captured the eerie atmosphere of the mystery and helped establish it as part of British literary culture. The poem was widely read and frequently anthologized, introducing the Flannan Isles mystery to audiences who might never have heard of it otherwise. It also established a romantic, almost supernatural interpretation of the events that influenced how the story was understood for generations. But perhaps more importantly, Gibson's poem helped preserve the memory of Thomas Marshall, James Ducat, and Donald MacArthur as individuals rather than merely as statistics in an official report, by imagining their final moments and giving voice to their fears and hopes. The poem ensured that they would be remembered as human beings who had faced extraordinary circumstances with courage and dedication. The literary treatment of the Flannan Isles mystery continued to evolve throughout the 20th century, reflecting changing cultural attitudes toward authority, technology, and the natural world. Early treatments tended to emphasize the heroic aspects of the keeper's service and the tragic nature of their sacrifice. Later works were more likely to question official explanations and to suggest that the mystery might conceal some form of conspiracy or cover-up. Dr. James Crawford, a literature professor at Glasgow University, who studied the cultural impact of the Flannan Isles mystery, identified 3 distinct phases in how the story was interpreted over time. The initial phase, from 1900 to about 1920, emphasized duty, sacrifice, and the struggle between human courage and natural forces. The middle phase, from the 1920s through the 1950s, was marked by increasing skepticism toward official explanations and growing interest in alternative theories. The final phase, beginning in the 1960s, saw the mystery reimagined as a symbol of broader social and political tensions. Each generation, Crawford observed, has found in the Flannan Isles mystery a reflection of its own anxieties and preoccupations. The story has served as a kind of cultural mirror, reflecting changing attitudes toward authority, expertise, and the relationship between individual and society. This cultural resonance helped ensure that the mystery remained alive in public consciousness, even as the practical importance of lighthouses diminished with advances in navigation technology. The story continued to fascinate new generations of readers and researchers, each bringing their own perspectives and methodologies to bear on the enduring questions. In 1971, when the Flannan Isles Lighthouse was finally automated, the last human keepers to serve there participated in a ceremony that both celebrated the technological achievement and mourned the end of an era. The ceremony was attended by representatives of lighthouse services from around the world, acknowledging the international significance of both the lighthouse itself and the mystery associated with it. Captain William Henderson, who had served as principal keeper at Flannan Isles from 1965 to 1971, spoke at the ceremony about what it had meant to carry on the work begun by Thomas Marshall and his colleagues. "We have been privileged," Henderson said, "to serve in a place where 3 brave men gave their lives in service of others. We have tried to honor their memory by maintaining the same standards of professionalism and dedication that they exemplified." The automation of the lighthouse marked the end of permanent human habitation on Eilean Mor, but it did not end interest in the mystery of the missing keepers. If anything, the removal of living keepers seemed to intensify the romantic and supernatural associations that had grown up around the lighthouse over the decades. The empty keepers' quarters became a destination for adventurous visitors who were drawn by the combination of dramatic scenery and mysterious history. The Northern Lighthouse Board, recognizing both the historical importance of the site and its potential dangers, established strict regulations governing access to the island, while also creating interpretive materials that would help visitors understand the significance of what they were seeing. The visitor experience at Eilean Mor was carefully designed to balance respect for the missing keepers with accurate historical information about lighthouse operations and maritime safety. The interpretive materials, prepared with input from maritime historians and former lighthouse keepers, emphasized the professional competence of the 3 men and the important role they had played in making Scottish waters safer for navigation. But the materials also acknowledged the enduring mystery of their disappearance, presenting the various theories that had been proposed over the years, while emphasizing that none had been definitively proven. The goal was to preserve the sense of mystery that made the site so compelling, while also ensuring that visitors understood the real human cost of maritime service. Dr. Sarah MacLeod, a maritime historian who helped develop the interpretive materials, explained the philosophy behind their approach. "We wanted visitors to come away with an appreciation for the dedication and professionalism of lighthouse keepers, not just fascination with an unsolved mystery." Thomas Marshall, James Ducat, and Donald MacArthur were real people who made real contributions to maritime safety. Their disappearance is certainly mysterious, but their lives and work were meaningful regardless of how they died. The interpretive materials also placed the Flannan Isles Lighthouse in its broader historical context, explaining the challenges of lighthouse construction and operation in remote locations, the evolution of lighthouse technology, and the gradual transition from manned to automated operations. Visitors learned not just about 3 missing men, but about an entire profession and the crucial role it had played in the development of maritime commerce. This educational approach proved successful in attracting visitors who were interested in maritime history, as well as those drawn by the mystery itself. The Lighthouse became a popular destination for school groups, maritime enthusiasts, and tourists seeking to understand Scotland's seafaring heritage. The site also attracted serious researchers who continued to investigate the disappearance using new technologies and methodologies. In 1985, a team from the University of Edinburgh used ground-penetrating radar to search for any evidence that might have been buried on the island. In 1992, marine archaeologists conducted underwater surveys around Eilean Mor, looking for debris or remains that might have been missed by earlier searches. None of these investigations produced definitive answers, but they did generate new data about the conditions on and around the island that helped refine understanding of what might have happened. The underwater surveys, in particular, revealed the complex topography of the sea floor around Flannan Isles and confirmed that the waters were indeed treacherous enough to make recovery of bodies extremely unlikely. Dr. Michael Robertson, who led the 1992 underwater survey, concluded that the marine environment around Eilean Mor was among the most dangerous he had encountered in 20 years of underwater research. The currents are unpredictable, the water is extremely cold, and there are countless underwater hazards that could trap or destroy anything that fell into the sea, Robertson reported. If the 3 keepers did somehow end up in the water, it's not surprising that no trace of them was ever found. As the 20th century drew to a close, the Flannan Isles mystery had become firmly established as one of maritime history's most enduring puzzles. It had inspired countless books, articles, documentaries, and academic studies, each adding new perspectives while acknowledging that the fundamental questions remained unanswered. The mystery had also become part of the professional culture of lighthouse keeping, passed down through generations of keepers as both a cautionary tale and an inspiration. Young men entering the lighthouse service learned about Thomas Marshall, James Ducat, and Donald MacArthur, not just as tragic figures, but as exemplars of the dedication and competence that the profession required. And Macpherson, who began his career as a lighthouse keeper in 1975, and eventually rose to become a senior official with the Northern Lighthouse Board, described the impact of the Flannan Isles story on his own professional development. You couldn't be a lighthouse keeper without thinking about those 3 men and what they represented. They showed us what it meant to take your responsibilities seriously, to maintain your equipment properly, to always be ready for whatever emergency might arise. Their disappearance was tragic, but their dedication was inspiring. Story also influenced the development of safety procedures and emergency protocols throughout the lighthouse service. The principle that at least 1 keeper must remain at the lighthouse at all times became even more rigorously enforced after the Flannan Isles incident. Communication systems were improved, backup equipment was standardized, and training programs were enhanced to ensure that keepers would be prepared for a wider range of potential emergencies. These improvements undoubtedly saved lives over the decades, making the lighthouse service safer for the men who chose to dedicate their careers to maritime safety. In this sense, the deaths of Thomas Marshall, James Ducat, and Donald MacArthur had meaning beyond their individual sacrifice. They contributed to the safety of all the keepers who came after them. As we enter the 21st century, the Flannan Isles Lighthouse continues to operate as an automated beacon, its light sweeping across the North Atlantic with the same regularity that the original keepers would have maintained. The keepers' quarters stand empty, but well preserved, a monument to the men who once lived and worked there. Modern visitors to Eilean Mor can experience something that earlier generations of investigators could not: a virtual reality reconstruction of the lighthouse as it would have appeared on the night of December 15, 1900, using historical records, architectural drawings, and artifacts recovered from similar lighthouse stations. Technology specialists have created an immersive experience that allows visitors to walk through the keeper's quarters, examine the equipment, and gain a deeper understanding of the daily routines that Thomas, James, and Donald would have followed. The virtual reconstruction includes audio narration based on the keeper's own log entries and letters, giving visitors a sense of their personalities and their commitment to their work. Visitors can experience the routine of trimming wicks, cleaning lenses, and recording weather observations, gaining an appreciation for the skill and dedication required to maintain a lighthouse in such a remote location. But perhaps most powerfully, the virtual experience allows visitors to stand in the lamp room at the top of the lighthouse, looking out over the same waters that the three keepers would have monitored for signs of ships in distress. From that vantage point, with the Atlantic stretching endlessly to the horizon, visitors can begin to understand both the isolation of the lighthouse keeper's existence and the crucial importance of the service they provided. The mystery of what happened to Thomas Marshall, James Ducat, and Donald MacArthur may never be solved. More than a century of investigation, speculation, and analysis has failed to produce definitive answers to the questions raised by their disappearance. We may never know what emergency drew them away from the safety of their lighthouse, or what fate befell them in the December darkness of 1900. But we do know something equally important. We know what they represented. They embodied the best traditions of the lighthouse service, the commitment to duty that led men to accept dangerous and isolated postings because they understood that their work saved lives. They maintained their lighthouse in perfect condition, followed established procedures, and took pride in their professionalism right up until the moment they vanished. In an age when human agency seems increasingly diminished by technological and economic forces, beyond individual control. The story of the Flannan Isles keepers reminds us that individual dedication and competence still matter. 3 men chose to dedicate their lives to keeping a light burning in one of the most remote and dangerous places on Earth. And they did so with skill, courage, and unwavering commitment to their responsibilities. Their disappearance was a tragedy, but their lives were a testament to the possibility of meaningful service in the face of danger and isolation. They joined the long tradition of lighthouse keepers who understood that their work was about more than maintaining equipment or following procedures. It was about serving as guardians for all who traveled the dangerous waters of the world. The light they tended still shines each night, an automated beacon that carries forward their mission of guiding ships safely through treacherous waters. Every vessel that passes safely through the North Atlantic owes something to their service and to the service of all the lighthouse keepers who came before and after them. Thomas Marshall, James Ducat, and Donald MacArthur disappeared on December 15, 1900, taking with them the answer to one of maritime history's greatest mysteries. But they left behind something more valuable than answers. They left an example of dedication, competence, and service that continues to inspire all who learn their story. And so, as we let our 3 lighthouse keepers rest in the embrace of the sea they served so faithfully, we remember that some mysteries are less important than the truths they reveal. The mystery of their disappearance may never be solved, but the meaning of their lives remains crystal clear. They were guardians of the light, protectors of all who sailed beneath the stars, faithful servants of the ancient compact between those who tend the shore and those who brave the sea. Sleep well, knowing that somewhere in the darkness, lights still shine to guide travelers safely home, tended by those who understand that some duties transcend the boundaries between life and death, between the known and the unknowable, between the lighthouse keeper's watch and eternity itself. But despite exhaustive investigation, no trace of Thomas Marshall, James Ducat, or Donald MacArthur was ever found. They had simply vanished, as completely as if they had never existed, leaving behind one of the most enduring mysteries in maritime history. The lighthouse on Eilean Mor was restaffed within a month of the discovery of the disappearance. The new keepers, carefully selected for their experience and psychological stability, took up their duties with full knowledge of what had happened to their predecessors. They maintained the light without incident for decades, and the Flannan light continued to guide ships safely through the treacherous waters of the North Atlantic. But the mystery of what happened to the original keepers has never been solved. Over the years, investigators, journalists, and amateur detectives have proposed dozens of theories to explain the disappearance. Some have suggested that the men were swept away by a massive wave while trying to secure equipment during a storm. Others have proposed that they fell victim to an accident involving the lighthouse machinery, and that their bodies were somehow lost at sea. More exotic theories have invoked everything from foreign spies to sea monsters, to supernatural forces. The isolation and eerie atmosphere of the Flannan Isles have made them fertile ground for speculation about paranormal phenomena, and the unexplained nature of the keeper's disappearance has only added to the mystique. But perhaps the most likely explanation is also the most tragic. That 3 dedicated men, performing a dangerous job in one of the most remote and unforgiving environments on Earth, encountered some combination of circumstances that overwhelmed even their considerable experience and skill. The sea that they had devoted their lives to making safer for others ultimately claimed them in a manner so complete and final that it left no trace behind. The lighthouse on Eilean Mor was eventually automated, like most Scottish lighthouses, eliminating the need for keepers to live in isolation on the remote island. The keepers' quarters now stand empty, maintained as a memorial to all the men who risked their lives to guide ships safely through dangerous waters. Visitors to the Flannan Isles today can see the lighthouse still standing proud and white against the gray Atlantic sky. The light still shines each night, powered now by solar panels and automated systems rather than oil flames and human vigilance. But on quiet evenings, when the wind is calm and the sea relatively peaceful, some visitors report that they can almost hear the echo of voices. 3 men going about their duties, checking equipment, recording weather observations, maintaining the endless vigil that was their calling and their pride. Thomas Marshall, James Ducat, and Donald MacArthur vanished on December 15th, 1900. But their dedication to the safety of others lives on in every ship that passes safely through the waters they once guarded. They became part of the sea they served, joining the countless others who have given their lives to the eternal struggle between human courage and the vast, indifferent power of the ocean. The mystery of their disappearance may never be solved, but their legacy is clear in every light that still shines from dangerous shores, in every keeper who takes up the lonely vigil, and in every life that is saved because someone cared enough to tend a light in the darkness. And with that gentle mystery, we let our 3 lighthouse keepers rest in the embrace of the sea they loved and served so faithfully. Their light may have gone out on that December evening more than a century ago, but the beacon of their dedication continues to shine, guiding us toward an understanding of duty, sacrifice, and the quiet heroism of those who choose to stand watch in the darkest places, so that others might find their way safely home. Sleep well, knowing that somewhere, in every corner of our world, there are still guardians keeping their faithful watch through the night.